Morning.
Hey, sorry I was late. I couldn't find my computer. It's just, I don't know what, that doesn't usually happen to me.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Okay. Everyone was so quiet. I thought my speakers weren't working. I think Christina can't make it today. She's got another meeting.
Okay.
So I think, Karthik, you should get started.
Yeah, did we have anything else to discuss, or should we just go ahead?
No, I think this is what we had, unless someone wants to bring up something else now before we start.
I
Yeah.
think, Tammy, I didn't get a chance to look at your email about heterogeneity. I did see all the different classes, but I don't know what the next steps are in terms of getting the data to you and Raidul and how we should do it and all of that. So we could have another discussion sometime later, but yeah.
Yeah, so I think the next steps are first having everyone critique it. Because I don't feel settled on it, certainly not without more comment. And then seeing if you can create such a cluster so that we no longer map heating type and heating fuel, but instead everything comes out in those clusters. And then we have more work to do with your heat maps too. So that's another question.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good to me.
I don't want to join.
What?
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say on this presentation, I'd be interested in hearing not only what you think, but some of the struggles that you've had, like what's been hard for you, because this looks hard, right? So it looks like maybe not data hard, although that I'm sure that's challenging too, but conceptually hard in terms of deciding what to include or not include, or even how to look at it. And so I think it would really help the group to hear that from you.
Oh, definitely. I have exactly that. So yes.
Okay, good.
Right. Yeah, I think just for today, I think just stop me like anywhere, because I'm pretty sure I'm not going to get through all of the slides. So I do want to make sure that whatever we cover is, kind of clear and everybody kind of agrees or at least understands, what's going on. Okay, so yeah, so the big question that I've been trying to look at is trying to figure out if, households that face these deprivations, is the feeling of deprivation really reflective of how you evaluate your life, thing put together. So that's sort of the overarching question that I'm trying to address. And then I sort of borrow from this framework quite a bit. So I just wanted to lay this out, trying to just map out this whole ecosystem together, but how our household consumption needs are related to evaluated well-being. So that's the one at the bottom. And then how that ultimately ties into our energy demand and industry supply chains. So I won't go into each of these connections. What I'm mostly interested in, also sort of slightly twisting consumption to make it deprivation rather than consumption. So lack of services rather than how much you're consuming, and how that is connected to subjective well-being. So this is pretty much all I'm going to talk about and all I've been working on, sort of making some assumptions of the other parts that have been grayed out.
Sorry, go ahead, Narasimha. You're first this time.
Well, I think you should, even in presenting this paper, you have to step back even one step further, like why this question in the first place, and how it's a gap in literature, right? So I think it's very important that you point out there's a lot of literature from decades on defining and understanding poverty
Mm-hmm.
in various and pointing out its multiple dimensions and deprivations, right? But there's a parallel literature that does not link to this. That's important. How do people feel about their own lives?
Mm-hmm.
And you, first of all, I think you want to make the point that for the very rare occasions where you have the ability to look at both together. But
Yeah,
that's a
I'll
data
get to
point,
that. Yeah,
huh?
I'll get to that
You're gonna
eventually,
get
but
to that.
yes.
But why is this important as a research question that you link how people feel about their own lives to basic deprivations?
Mm.
I think it's really important. I think it's really a really important question to understand. It's almost a validation of the. Are you using subjective well-being as a validation of the basic needs theories that these deprivations are in fact what constitute poverty? Or one could use for other reasons that you can track improvements, whether improvements or what, sorry, the relative importance of deprivations could be gleaned by looking at how progress in filling gaps leads to changes in life satisfaction, for example, right? So there's so many different questions you could ask of this. I think it's really important to lay that out up front.
Yeah, I'll let the slides speak for themselves in a couple of slides. So
Okay.
I want immediately respond to that. And for today's presentation, yeah, I don't have a lot of existing literature just by choice because I wanted to focus more on what I've been doing. But it is a conscious choice to not have existing literature. But I think your point is taken that you know that'll help in motivation. Tammy,
Karthik,
you have
for
something?
the group who's not accustomed to this framing, can you say a couple words about what you mean by cognitions and what kind of things are associated with it?
Uh, I think cognitions could be anything from, how do I describe?
It's basically people's attitudes and values and beliefs for the most part.
Right, maybe.
It's what's going on inside their head as opposed to stuff outside them, the context that influences their choices.
Right. So, for example, I could think of uh, a metric like self-reported health. So it's interesting how different groups, even though their objective conditions are the same, the way they evaluate that is very different. So, which probably falls in the context of, yeah, cognition, where, yeah, the way you think about objective conditions is different just based on your cultural background, the environment around you, all of that. So,
And then this would include environmental attitudes and risk aversion and things like that.
well, I don't know if that falls under social context or cognitions. Maybe there's an overlap between
Yeah, okay.
both of those.
Well, environmental attitudes and risk aversion, I think, are properties of people's decision making, which could be partly influenced by the social context.
Yeah, instinctively I put them in cognitions, but the point is not to split those hairs right now. It is just to bring forward some of the things that we've been thinking about that fit in this framework and where they would belong.
And I'm guessing all of these four are also correlated to some extent, right? Because your cognition is probably correlated to your socioeconomic factors, also depending on your built environment. So maybe they're not exclusive categories as such.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to focus the study on subjective well-being completely, and I'll get back to why we are trying to do this, because, and then look at how your other needs and deprivations are connected to your evaluation of your own life. So I've chosen 4 different categories here. So food, mobility, housing, and energy, and how each of those could be linked to your overall subjective well-being. I mean, there's some definitely criticism as to why only 4 of these, and why not more? Like, for example, water is something that people have spoken about a lot in the existing literature. You could think about financial insecurities, financial needs. So, I mean, there's a combination of, the data being available and how strong the links are between these basic needs and well-being. So it's sort of an iterative process that I'll go through in sort of coming up with these 4 categories. But if somebody asks, like, why can you not include a 5th one, then, well, you could if you had enough data and good variables that represent those insecurities. So yeah. And then we wanted to study all of this in the context of the built environment. So not just what is happening at the household level and what households need, but also how is that linked to things outside the house. So these could be just environmental stressors like climate, air pollution, chemical exposure, or also things like public transportation connectivity, electricity infrastructure, public transportation density, things like that. So this is sort of the overall uh, breadth of the study that I'm trying to look at. And
That's
yeah,
a
we
good
want to
question. I feel like we're gonna need 2 hours for this if we keep asking questions. So I'm sorry, but what's the opposite of the word stressor? Because there should be. Is there one? I feel like it should be stressors and promoters or something, or stressors, and because it like green space and so more of a
a
addition
positive
than
word.
deprivation. So anyway, I think the category is fine, but I think that also framing it with a positive aspect could bring a lot more things to mind in the audience.
That's a good point. Yeah, I didn't consider positive spin on the environment. Non-stressors is not a good word.
De-stressors.
De-stressors, non-stressors, unstressors. Yeah.
Okay, we can look for that. You don't have to find it.
All right. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So there are existing, ways to look at these connections and what each of these things actually mean. Like, what do you mean by food needs? What do you mean by well-being? Like from a more rigorous theoretical perspective. So you do have these different frameworks that try to capture each of these things in their own way, coming from different uh, disciplines. So yeah, you have the basic needs framework, uh, going back to maybe the early 1600s. Then you have the more recent positive psychology frameworks where you look at measures of satisfaction, happiness, positive, negative feelings, and things like that. And you have the capabilities approach, which sort of translates practically into the Human Development Index, although there is more nuance to that. And you have more, I guess, expenditure and income cutoffs that government agencies usually use because it's probably the most easiest to implement. And what we are interested in is looking at questions or ideas that fall somewhere in between these frameworks, because the whole idea being, if you want to know if a household is doing well, why don't you just ask them? So, I mean, it seems easy, but then, how much can you ask a household? And some of the questions that you'd ask that sort of fall in between these different disciplines are questions like, yeah, do you think, travel is a burden for you, rather than looking at, how many bus stops are there in an area. So we do want to rely directly on people's evaluation to know if they're doing well, rather than inferring from data that, that's out there. So that's sort of, I don't know, Sima, if that gets to your initial question as to why and how we are doing this, and why is this important or different from what, already exists.
Yeah, let's keep going so we see
Okay.
the full logic of your presentation.
Yeah, and I don't want to take time from you, Karthik, but some of this is similar to what I've been struggling with for Ellison's paper. And so I think after this, I sorry, stammering. I would really, what I've been trying to do is kind of chart a path through how to start with something overarching like the capabilities framework, and recognize that you're taking a subset of it, and have a sense of how holistic it is. And so, and then how do you know which ones you need? So you may be addressing that question. How do you know which ones to pick out? And I have some really fuzzy ideas. What's been holding me up from presenting them to you is my inability to express them in words. And then when I do express them in words, I find how fuzzy they are, and then I feel like I'm not ready to talk about them. But I think it would be a good discussion. And I think that you would contribute a lot because of the way you've worked through this part.
Oh yeah, I think definitely. I think the advantage that I sort of have is because I have data, so I can, well, test out some of the things, and if something's not reliable, then I can drop it and say, hey, there's no data for this, so I can stop thinking about that indicator. So
Yeah,
yeah, but
absolutely.
I mean, since you're bringing it up, I just we have to be a little bit careful about how we present these broad, overarching theories. I keep telling you, Karthik, I'm not so comfortable with how you presented it here. I see that I would put the welfare-based capabilities and basic needs on one side and emotional evaluative on the other. They fall into like a hierarchy. It's the ultimate measure of well-being is capability-based. The basic needs are thinking about satisfiers to achieve elements of those capabilities, and then welfare-based are essentially means to even achieve those satisfiers. So they're kind of in a hierarchy themselves, and we just one is very close to policy, one is abstract but fundamental,
right.
But I don't know how much you need to. That's why I wanted to withhold my comment based on what I was where going with it, and then we can come back to how you need to frame this.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with you that maybe there's a better way to organize these bubbles.
Well, do you need them?
Yeah.
That's also my question. But I say you keep going.
Okay. Yeah. Let's keep going. Okay. So from a more practical perspective, how do we achieve this? So what I've done is I've focused everything centered on subjective well-being, and more specifically life satisfaction. So that's the one in the center. And we're going to use variables from we would like to use variables from each of these surveys to capture, the four different insecurities that or needs that we, talked about a little earlier. So what exactly those are, we'll get to that in a little moment, but this is the breadth of the survey. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different surveys that we'll be using to get the variables that we think we might need to answer this question. Okay, so we saw the overarching question, and within that, I wanted to look at 3 different sub-questions. So the first one is there a penalty on life satisfaction if your basic needs are not being met? And the second question is sort of touching on the heterogeneity of this. So who do we think are the most vulnerable when we look at this question from a life satisfaction perspective? And then finally, how well do existing, let's say, poverty thresholds capture these deprivations? So those are the sub questions that I was interested in this framework.
But can I just pause for a second to understand the second question? I'm not fully sure where you're coming from on that. What do you mean? I'm not sure what you mean by based on the extent of penalty.
Well, what I meant by that is who takes a bigger hit. So if the connection between basic needs and life
Okay.
satisfaction, who takes the biggest hit if
Okay.
they're facing, is it like households with children, is it a particular race, gender, who is going to suffer the most when they have these deprivations?
So I think you're talking about some demographic characteristics that receive the greater penalties.
Correct.
Because I think the way it's written, and this is just a picky point, the way it's written, it sounds circular, right? You define a penalty and then you say they're vulnerable, but that's not what you're asking. You're identifying vulnerability by the amount of penalty, and then you're looking at maybe where those people reside or what are other characteristics of their situation.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, we do need a data set that would answer these questions. So I think I've spoken about this quite a bit in the past. I won't get into how we generated this data set. I will get into the quality of the variables and picking those variables, but for now, let's maybe accept to some extent that we are able to generate this data set. And this is what the data set looks like. So we have 40 copies of 40 implicates of this data set, and then we're going to run the analysis and pool our results from all of these to sort of minimize our error bars. So for today's presentation, I've just worked on 10 implicates because I was still sort of troubleshooting a bunch of different things, but ultimately I'd scale it up to 40, and then yeah, that'll be the final version. Okay, so what is sort of the underlying assumption or hypothesis that I'm sort of working with? So we want to look at everything from the life satisfaction perspective, because the way the question is framed is, how do you evaluate your life on a scale of 0 to 10, everything else considered? So we'll sort of believe that question in saying that when people answer that, they are considering everything in their life, which hopefully will include the basic needs that we are interested in. So yeah, so my sort of argument or hypothesis is that the basic needs deprivation, let's say the feeling of being uncomfortably cold, is linked to life satisfaction. And what I'm calling as indicators, so these could be your energy consumption. Do you have the right heating equipment? Do you have enough money to pay your bills? All of those are linked to your basic needs deprivation, which are ultimately connected to how you evaluate your entire life. So this is the working hypothesis. You could argue for different connections, but this is what I'm laying down. Okay, so the next question is, how do you choose indicators for these deprivations and for these more objective indicators? So the way I've gone about this is, I guess, these 4 different criteria. So the first one is does it already exist? Has there been, enough work either by existing literature or the survey agencies themselves that have put down certain variables saying that we think this is pretty robust, this is how we are going to do it. And in those cases, I've just gone ahead and just chosen those. So for example, food insecurity, there's already a variable that comes from the USDA that classifies a household as being, food insecure or not. So I've not made any modifications to those. I've just, straight up used the food insecurity variable in that case. So similarly, energy insecurity, there's a variable that exists from the EIA, and I've just chosen that. And then second criteria is, whether it's available in the survey and what is the quality of that variable. So to give you an example for availability and quality is that of evictions. So the housing community is like very obsessed, interested in evictions, and there's a lot of literature on evictions. But then if you look at the survey data for AHS, there's about only 1%, I think, population that reports some sort of eviction. So that didn't seem like a good variable to me. So that is the reason why I didn't choose evictions to sort of represent housing insecurity. Another
Karthik,
example, yeah,
work in the AHS? I mean, these variables that are about transients, whether it's eviction or whether it's moving or having transited between one state and another, like having very high healthcare bills where you did not previously. How does that kind of change show up in the surveys?
sorry, could you repeat your question again? I don't think I
Well,
understood.
like the variables that are about making a change, an abrupt change, like an eviction, how does that appear in a survey? Because did they say, like, have you been evicted in the last year, or
Yes, they do. They do.
and do
So
they like have number of times?
they don't have number of times. So this particular question is, did you move and why did you move
Did you move
effectively?
and why did you move? Okay. And then it's they're asked of people who are in a house, right?
Correct.
So then those people would have had to gain access to a stable housing situation in order to be surveyed.
Correct.
And so it means they're not homeless, but they're also not in a shelter, and they're not like if somebody didn't have anywhere to go and they went to their grandmother's house or something, then the grandmother would be surveyed.
Yes. So in this, well, yeah, it depends on who's being asked the question. So in this case, I'm guessing that these people moved into a new house and they said that they've been evicted from their previous situation. So
Right, but that implies that they've had enough stability, credit, and so on to be
to
allowed
get a
to
new,
move to a new house.
correct.
But this is a bit of a tangent, right? This is an example of something you did not pick, right?
Correct. Yes.
That's true. Oh, and I don't want to dive into it, but I mean, I did dive into it, I guess. But my point was that the shocks that affect well-being are, I think, maybe not well represented in the surveys. Adam just put something in the chat, so
That's probably true. Yeah, that's probably true.
yeah. So
Shocks.
that was my only point. I was not trying to get you to go after evictions, but just to say that some things that are very strong might not be captured.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah. I mean, yeah, again, we are limited by data in this case because there is no good way to represent that in the existing data. So yeah. And another sort of reverse example, I would say, is with health. So for example, both Gallup and NHTS have a question about self-reported health. So in theory, I could have chosen either of those. but then the NHTS is almost twice the size of the Gallup survey. So I sort of decided to use the NHTS health variable rather than the Gallup health variable because it's just a better survey to use. So those are some of the choices that just two examples of choices that I had to make when coming up with a list of potential variables that are associated with life satisfaction. And there's more. Yeah. Right. So these are the final sort of list I came up with. So the deprivations are the subjective deprivations. So you have travel, housing, food, and energy insecurities. And the objective ones are the ones that I had to also spend some more time thinking about. So for example, food. So it shows, whether you've been receiving food stamps or using food stamps or not as an indicator for objective indicator for food insecurity. Again, there's other options such as you could look at calorie intake from a survey that was conducted in 2014. So although that would have been a really nice variable to have, but then it's from 5 years ago. It's a pretty small survey, so I had to sort of give up on that variable and sort of stick to food stamps. So similarly for energy, I could have considered appliance ownership. So for example, if you had a heat pump or if you had air conditioning, but then I also had energy consumption numbers. Again, that was a choice that I made. So I decided to go with energy consumption. The AHS one was much more straightforward because it's a housing adequacy question based on objective conditions in the house that the survey itself and the housing development, the HDA comes up with. So I didn't have to do anything for that. And finally, for the transportation, this is again a tricky one because the existing literature has a bunch of different metrics to quantify, mobility transportation. So I went with the number of transfers that household reported every day. So for example, you're going from your house to work to anywhere else, how many transfers of public transportation are you making in order to get to your destination? And there are other things like you could look at commute time, you could look at the time it takes you to get to your transit station. So all of those do exist in the existing literature and they are valid to some extent, but I decided to go with daily transfers in this case. So yeah, so that's sort of some of the choices I had to make in order to come up with a list of variables that I'd be using for the study.
Why did you prefer that to commute time?
Commute time was tricky because I think it's a non-linear thing because people do like to travel, not like, but may prefer travel to longer distances to perhaps make more money. So it's
Oh,
not
yeah.
necessarily a linear effect. And I felt either transit waiting time, like how long do you wait every day, and the number of transfers, I felt maybe people would want to minimize that generally to avoid the feeling of,
Yeah,
so that
I
was
think
sort of the
that's
reasoning for
reasonable.
why.
I think
Yeah.
that's reasonable. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the full picture. So we are trying to understand life satisfaction based on the basic needs indicators that we came up with, but in the context of, well, everything else, right? So we do want to include income, expenditure in our models. And then we do want to have a bunch of socio-demographic controls, geographic controls, and also social factors. So that's something that I haven't really spoken about, I think, in the introduction too, but I've, you know, through the analysis, I've sort of found out that, social factors are also important. So I decided to include those in the model as well. So I'll just leave this for like maybe 5-10 seconds so that you can get a sense of, what variables are going to be in the regression.
I'm pretty sure you have a deep reasoning behind every single one of the things you put here, so I'm not going to ask about them because we'll just trust you for right now. But I think it would be interesting as they come up to remember that you did have to make a choice and that can affect the results.
Definitely, yes, yes. Okay, so yes, I came up with this list, and then, well, I had to generate the variables, run the fusion thing. And then the first sort of step was to make sure that the variables we've generated are of, reasonable quality. So what we have here is on the y-axis, the median absolute percent error, and on the x-axis is the subset size. So what we do is we create different subsets of the populations, and we compare how different they are between the original survey and the fuse survey. And the difference is the one that's being plotted on the y-axis. And generally we see that, as you have larger and larger slices and you compare those, the errors are pretty small. It's only when you're working with very small subsets that you run into large errors when you compare the fuse sample versus the original sample. And again, this is one of the iterations with the variables as well, because there's some really interesting variables that when I fuse them and I do this analysis, then I see that the errors are pretty high. So then I had to drop, like evictions, for example, would show up to be pretty high, and the other low sample variables, again, which would have pretty high error. So I had to drop those as well in this iterative process of coming up with a list of variables. And
wait, what are you showing here?
so you could let's pick number the NHTS one, right? So for the NHTS one, I have
Oh, I
five
see.
different variables that I've
Yeah.
fused. So I've health, number of transfers, travel and security, transit times, and then travel wait times. And then health, for example, you see that the error is less than 10%, even if you're slicing, you're looking at just 0.1% of the sample size. And then once you get to high, it's like almost.
Yeah. Okay, but the
close.
number of transfers is one that you spoke about having chosen, and then that has a high. Am I seeing
That
it
is
right?
pretty high. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. So that is pretty high when you're looking at low subsets, low sample sizes. But once you're looking at the whole survey together, you're still under 10%. So I think, again, this is maybe a choice in terms of, well, what is the cutoff you might want to use when you want to discard some variables or not.
Yeah, I guess it depends on whether it affects your final analysis, that high
Right.
error. Yeah.
Well, I think if you're going to present this, you need to show a vertical line where your sample sizes you're picking in terms of your spatial granularity. of your analysis to provide confirmation, validation
Mhm.
that your errors are small, right?
Yeah.
It's difficult for the reader to understand what to take away from this in terms of your analysis.
Mhm. Right. Okay. Yeah. I'll do that. Okay. So the first step that I wanted to do was, are these subjective insecurities reflective of objective conditions? So not even looking at life satisfaction altogether, but just looking at these insecurities individually and then running a regression to see. So for example, if your mobility insecurity, is it uh, related to number of transfers? So we chose these objective and subjective metrics. So first I wanted to sort of establish that these are actually related, and we have to sort of establish confidence in both of these metrics that we've chosen. So what I did is, yeah, for each of these four, I've run a regression on whether you've experienced insecurity or not over a bunch of controls. And I'll just walk you through one of these examples. So for the mobility, for example, the the higher number is the more likely you're likely to experience mobility insecurity. And that's related to your race. If you're Latino, there's more likelihood. Similarly, if you're fall below the federal poverty threshold, you're more likely. Bad health, race, if you have children, the more number of transfers, you're more likely to fall into saying that you are facing mobility insecurity. So I run similar exercises for all the other metrics as well.
One second, Karthik, I'm not fully sure here.
Mm-hmm.
So sounds like you're trying to test whether the number of transfers is related to mobility insecurity.
Correct.
So, but you're showing how slightly different thing. You're showing the influence of surround social, demographic, and other contextual characteristics on that relationship.
Correct.
So, what is the x-axis here?
So the x-axis is the odds of you experiencing mobility insecurity. So it's a logistic regression model where you yes or no for experiencing mobility insecurity, and what are the covariates for experiencing mobility insecurity.
Okay, so you want to highlight that number of transfers in that
Okay.
thing,
Yeah.
right?
Correct. Yes.
It sounds like you're saying that if you just use race as a proxy, it's better than using number of transfers.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Also saying that mobility insecurity is more than just number of transfers. I think ultimately what I wanted to get to, maybe this is not the right way to do it, but saying that the feeling of deprivation is not just objective metrics, it's beyond objective metrics. So there are other factors that lead to you feeling insecure. That is not just having inadequate housing or not having, heating or AC or having food stamps. There's more to the story of your insecurity than these objective metrics. All the objective metrics are part of the story. So that is why I wanted to show there is a significant correlation, but there's more sort of confounding factors.
But in
So,
the other, Sorry, yeah. In the other three, you put the variable of interest, the objective variable of interest first. So energy
No, it's
insecurity, the
it's
no
just the
heat.
it's just the x-axis. So whatever is the highest falls.
Yeah, but I'm saying in the other three ones, it's a much stronger, the
Much,
strongest.
yes.
So mobility is the one where it's the least
Well,
correlated.
also, I don't know how much of it is the numeric part because number of transfers, it's a continuous number, whereas the other ones are yes and no questions. So I don't know how much of that is reflected in,
Mhm.
yeah. So
Why
maybe
would
if
you
I
put,
create, Mhm.
you could put commute times in that. I mean, just to test out the other options, no? This is a way
Yeah,
of
that's what I
testing.
did. So this is what I did. I didn't show everything here. So I tried commute time, transit wait time, number of trips to transit stations. So I tried a bunch of all of these, and then the number of transfers was the one that showed the strongest link to mobility and security. So yeah, that's how I ended up with this number of transfers.
So just for presentation, Karthik, I think it would be good to remind the audience what measure you were using for food insecurity and energy insecurity here. You stated this earlier, but then there were a number of measures that were associated. And so this is feeling
Yes, this is the
for energy
feeling.
insecure. And what is the actual question that they were asked?
So it's based on three indicators. So it is whether you've foregone basic necessities to pay your bills, whether you've kept your house at an uncomfortable temperature,
Okay.
or if you faced a disconnection in the past 6 months.
But maybe this is too picky, but I feel like you asked certain things, then you decided, not you, but ACS or whatever it was, the survey people decided that that was deprivation. And to
Mhm.
me, that's a little bit different than asking somebody if they're worried about energy security, which is, I realize, not a thing that is really tractable to pose and answer for the general
Mhm.
public. But I just want to call out that somebody else decided what that feeling of deprivation felt like, not the household.
Yes, in that particular case. So for example, travel or mobility in this case is, do you think travel is a financial burden for you? So that one's more, in
Yeah,
line with what you said.
it does feel more in line. Yeah, that's
And food,
interesting.
yeah, food is sort of derived again by the agency. So yeah, it's not, you're right. I mean, it's not directly asking people, have you faced food insecurity? Sort of inferring from a bunch of subjective questions.
Yeah, like
So
they weren't asked, are you afraid you won't have enough to eat?
they did, yes. For the
They
food,
did.
yes.
They
Yes.
did. Yeah. Okay.
Are you questioning the validity of those questions? To me, it's a better way to be specific about what you're asking than it just because people may have different interpretations of what insecurity is, and if they give you a yes no and you don't know where it's coming from, whereas here you know where it's coming from because the question is specific about the fact that you're giving something else up or you're not feeling comfortable at home. So I don't feel you're absolutely right. It's survey determined, but I don't have a problem with it.
I don't have a problem with it either, but I don't think we should
Okay.
present it as a household's feeling. I
Well,
think I think it is a fine thing to rely upon since there are these objective or more or maybe tied to something questions, like more specific questions where they're giving people an opportunity to respond around specific things rather than a general sense. But I still think that we should be careful about what we attribute to the household or the respondent having expressed. That's all. It's a fine point, but I'm cautious about speaking for others.
It's a good point. I think in the case of energy, because I think you could argue it's an objective indicator, not a subjective indicator in some ways. Did you give up money to pay your bills? Is an objective condition that is, we are judging as energy insecurity. So actually, that's a good point. As opposed to the other ones, we are just asking about whether they feel it's a burden or it's feeling insecure. So I actually agree with that. With the energy questions, I'm not. It could go either way. Thinking about it as a subjective or objective indicator.
If it's helpful, I've used the word experiential, which I find really hard to say, to describe those variables that capture like recollections of experiences. Because
Right,
someone might come along and say, well, there's recall bias, and maybe they didn't really get evicted, or I don't know, So I think
right,
that's a nice term to use as well.
right. Yeah, yeah. Experiential. Right. Yeah. Good point. Good point.
Good.
Something to
But
think
then
about.
yeah,
Hmm?
think about, because, well, I think at some point, well, somebody has to make a judgment. I mean, we do want the households to make that judgment.
I
But
mean,
for
the
example,
uncomfortably cold is a judgment, right? That's a subjective question. It's not an object. Did you feel uncomfortably cold? Were you uncomfortable? That's an experiential a judgment, I would say. So maybe it's a question of not blending those three together.
but then, did you skip meals to pay your bills? Where does that fall, right? Because it's still an action. It's not objective to me, but it's a choice, or it's a subjective choice. Yeah, I don't know how to classify that one.
Yeah, I think it's worth, I don't have a problem with the measures you chose, Karthik, and I think you have good
Mhm.
reasoning for choosing them. I just think it's worth saying explicitly what was done and what it represents,
Agreed. Yeah.
right? That people with experience thought these were good indicators, or good, I don't know, recollections of experience. We might need a word for this, right? It seems sort of neither objective fully nor subjective fully.
Mhm.
Anyway, yep. Okay, we don't have much time left, so
Yeah, maybe I'll just stop here for now, because but after this, what I've done is we'll look at life satisfaction, and then, like, throw everything at it. So all the variables that I discussed a couple of slides ago, and then see if our insecurities still stick or not. And what we ultimately find is that, well, yeah, our insecurities do stick, and they contribute negatively to your life satisfaction, everything else considered. So I've tried a bunch of different models. I could just do subjective indicators. So these are all the feelings that we just saw. And then I can add the objective ones into the model, and we still see that these insecurities contribute negatively to your life satisfaction.
what are the
Uh,
numbers on the right-hand graph, Karthik?
so on the right. Yes. So these are, again, you run a regression model with life satisfaction and all the different control variables, and the x-axis is the regression coefficient for the four different insecurities. So the negative would mean it is contributing negatively towards life satisfaction.
Right, so
So
that's, I mean, what, yeah.
So energy is the one that's contributing the most negatively, and housing, is the least negative.
That just seems weird.
Is this 0.1 on the Cantrell ladder score absolute value? The marginal effect of being insecure?
No, I've not done that. So the marginal effect might be, from what I remember, maybe 0.2 or 0.3 on the Cantrell scale. So this is just the regression coefficient. So
I know, but what's the outcome variable is the life satisfaction score, isn't it?
correct. Yeah. So I don't on the Cantrell scale. Yes. sinking into
So
it.
this
Yes.
is the value on the Cantrell scale, because it's not a
Correct.
logit, it's just a straightforward regression.
It's a straightforward. Yeah.
So it's just a 0.1 difference in life satisfaction score if you're
Correct.
insecure versus not insecure,
If you're energy insecure.
energy insecure. So now I remember, you had shown how this is significant, but in the context of other factors that influence people's life satisfaction, this is tiny,
So yeah,
right?
so that's the one on the left. So you could see at the
Mm.
very most bottom, you have things like poverty, never being married, being divorced,
Mm.
which are quite negative. And on the other extreme, things like being more social, being older, having more education, working, all of those are, fairly positive. And then you have insecurities sitting somewhere in between in the
When
list
you
of
pull an
values.
arrow from the left to the right, from each of the four, where they stand, you know what I mean? So you can see where they stand compared to everything else. Because this is a zoom into those four insecurity variables.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
If you just highlight them on the left graph,
On the left, sure. Yeah.
it
Got
puts
it.
them into, just darken it to something, those
Yeah,
four bullets.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just really surprised that energy insecurity has a stronger effect than housing insecurity. Like, and that's based on nothing, right? It's based on what I think I would feel like, which is totally irrelevant.
What's
Well,
the insecurity, housing insecurity question exactly?
right, let me go. Yeah. So I think a
Oh,
lot of it is also how these variables are defined, right? Because
mm,
if I drop something for energy insecurity, for example, then it will change, yeah, the result. So
yeah, but then back again to what I think of as housing insecurity, which is, are you likely to lose your house?
And this is not anything to do with that.
No.
right.
This is, we really have to be careful about what we use. Like housing rating worse compared to neighborhood. So, I mean, if I'm in a luxurious suburb and I feel my house is not as nice as my neighbors, I'll be known as which is the case with me. The street I live in has got all these mansions on it. And I'm housing insecure by that definition.
Well, again, the question is, right, how much do you believe what people say? And if people are saying, well, we are not doing well, how can you like impose your own view saying that, hey, actually, I think you're doing well. You're just delusional with, where you are. I mean, it's probably true, could be true, but the whole question is like, do you rely on people's feeling of what they say?
No, it also depends upon what you're asking the feeling about. Are you feeling insecure about losing your home this year? That's a feeling, but that's a much more important related to insecurity rather than just, am I keeping up with the Jones?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's very, very different. So,
Agreed. Agreed.
whereas I think with energy insecurity, if you were to stick with the uncomfortably cold or foregoing necessities, that is quite legitimately an insecurity if you're literally not eating because of that, or
Mhm.
not keeping cold. So I think,
Mm-hmm.
and even the travel one is also a little bit less severe, in terms of you're paying more than you want, but you know,
Yeah, for travel, there's few more options. So one is, do you take public transportation to save money? So that's one option. Another option is, does your neighborhood have enough public transportation connectivity? And another question is, do you bike or walk to save money?
Yeah, but I realize there are questions to be asked about each of these and choosing the appropriate indicators. But my surprise at seeing the housing insecurity have such low influence is now mediated by a feeling that that doesn't reflect many extreme aspects of insecurity that I think would affect well-being. Like,
Yeah.
do you have stability in the place that you're living, which then, translates to, first of all, it affects all that travel stuff. Secondly, it takes a great deal of time, and then it affects every aspect of your life, right? It affects whether you can hold on to your property, for example. And so I guess I'm not saying that, choose different variables, Karthik, because you've thought about it a lot. I just might not call it housing insecurity, which has really strong roots in other, like, the housing people will not be happy to see this called housing insecurity. That would be my guess.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think
Housing
that's very
housing
valid. It's
advocates.
very valid.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any such? You probably don't have variables that are so reflect severe stability, right? That's the reason why you looked at this.
Right. I mean, we have evictions, so that's probably the most defendable if from the housing community perspective. Yeah, I think the evictions is probably the closest because there is housing like objective conditions like leaks and broken walls, windows. That is covered by the objective indicator that we have. So it's just a subjective part that we are missing. So there's
Yeah,
a
the evictions would be,
adequacy.
yeah, the evictions may be the better one. You're concerned about the sample. Anyway, let's take a closer look. We should certainly focus on the strongest variables.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I need to go. I'm happy to
Yeah.
someone else host if you want to continue discussion, but I'll need to take off.
I need to go too, actually, right now.
Karthik, do you want to leave it open? So
I can just hang on. Yeah, I can just give me the.
yeah, I can make you the host in case other people have questions.
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Karthik. Let's talk later about it.
I think this is
Yeah.
really good, Karthik. I mean, we had a lot of questions and criticisms, but I think you presented it really clearly. That's part of what made us able to ask all those questions.
You're on mute if you're talking to us, Karthik.
Oh, yeah,
Okay, I
thank
gotta
you.
go.
No, this is
Thank you,
exactly what I had in
Karthik.
mind. Okay, yeah, thanks for the feedback.
Thanks.
Yes.
We'll talk later, Karthik. Bye.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, bye. Oh, Sarah, you're the only one. Yeah. Sorry, you're mute.
Seems I should also go because I have
Okay, yeah.
been with Tammy.
Oh, okay, yes.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. It was really good and informative.
Yeah,
Have a
thank you
good
so
day.
much. You too. See ya.
Bye.